We don't look around usually and think, yeah, most of our culture is Christian. And there's a good reason for that because very few people actually have a biblical worldview.
I want to start by talking about some data that you share in your book. You note that according to Barna Research, 65% of Americans identify themselves as Christians, yet you call Christians a, quote, worldview minority. So can you explain that a little bit? How can Christians be a worldview minority when so many people in our country are saying, yeah, I'm a Christian?
Yeah, great question. So it's actually the Pew Forum. They're an organization that's really well known for doing all this kind of research on religious trends in America. And so they have these studies called the Religious Landscape Studies, where they track how people identify themselves as Christians. And so in the most recent study that they've done, I believe in 2019, what they found is that when you ask people, how do you identify, and you give them these options, atheist, agnostic, a Jewish, Mormon, Christian, 65% of Americans do identify themselves as a Christian. But we have to remember that that's really how people self identify, and it can mean all kinds of things. You can have somebody who maybe went to church when they were a kid and don't really have any other thoughts about their faith as an adult, but it's kind of the closest thing to which they would identify. And so they say, I'm a Christian. And you can have people who claim to be a Jesus follower in some way, whatever that might mean to them, but not really hold to any kind of beliefs that you would be thinking of when you hear the word Christian. And so what we really need to better understand is, what do people actually believe? What is their worldview? Because that's going to be more determinant of their function in society and what we notice in our culture around us. And so for that, we can turn to the research from the American Worldview Inventory, which is conducted out of Arizona Christian University. They have a cultural research center there, instructed by Dr. George Barna. And what they found, using a whole battery of questions, really dozens of questions, looking at what people believe and how they live out their faith, they found that 6% of people in America have a biblical worldview. And of course, depending on the particular survey and the questions, that's going to vary a little bit. But the point is that it's going to be almost certainly something less than 10%. And so when we think about that gap between 65% of Americans who say, yes, I'm a Christian, and 6% who actually have what we would consider to be some kind of functioning biblical worldview, where people are holding to the core truths taught in the Bible and seeking to live accordingly, that's just a huge difference. And it explains so much about what we see in culture, right? Because we don't look around usually and think, yeah, most of our culture is Christian. And there's a good reason for that, because very few people actually have a biblical worldview. And one side note that I think is really interesting too is, this is also a problem within the church.
Mm-hmm.
So same researchers have found that only about 21% of Christians in evangelical Protestant churches have a biblical worldview. So we're a minority. If you seek to have a biblical worldview, we're a minority, not just in our culture, but even in the church. So many implications for that.
Yeah, and you quote the words of Jesus from John 15. I'm going to read those and then ask you to comment. Jesus said, if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will also keep yours. But all these things they will do to you on account of my name, because they do not know him who sent me. If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not have been guilty of sin, but now they have no excuse for their sin. Whoever hates me hates my Father also. If I had not done among them the works no one else did, they would not be guilty of sin, but now they have seen and hated both me and my Father. And but the word that is written in their law must be fulfilled. They hated me without a cause. And so it's obvious from, this is what you wrote, it's obvious from Jesus' own words that we should never expect to live in a culture where it's standard for people to have a biblical worldview. This is why Christians should probably not be all that surprised by this.